Daniel Penny has been arrested for lynching Jordan Neely. And while people are celebrating this, I would caution you it might be a little bit too soon because this is not clearly enough. First of all, it's not enough because the other two accomplices who took part in lynching Jordan Neely are still on the loose. The law is clear. If you're with someone and they commit a crime and you're merely there, you can be charged too. Well, in this case, these two individuals took part in his killing. They should be charged. At the very least, you can bet these two pieces of trash will flip on the killer. But that brings us to the second problem, Alvin Bragg. He doesn't want to see that president of punishing a white supremacist for harming a black person. To him, this is not a legal matter, it's a political problem. The public has been galvanized and is demanding punishment for the killer. So Alvin Bragg can't afford to do absolutely nothing, but he also can't afford to displease the white wealthy interests who made him DA and who he's counting on to fund his future political ambitions. Those people are as racist as Daniel Penny. Hell, they come from the same area he does. And they demand that killings like the one that Penny committed be done as a way of sending a racial message to black New Yorkers that they can be killed with impunity, everyone can know it was a crime, but nothing will be done about it. That way, hopefully, black New Yorkers will be scared out of the city. But the two black bootlicks that they put in office are finding out that that job is easier said than done. Officer Eric Adams of the NYPD, who also moonlights as mayor, I hear, went to City University of New York's School of Law to deliver the commencement speech for their graduation. The New York Times reports that Officer Adams was given the welcome he deserved. The students, and these are law students, mind you, many of them with doctorates, booed when the speaker said that Officer Adams was up next to speak. And when Officer Adams took to the podium, it got even worse. The students stood up and turned their backs on him. The boos and heckling continued and became more intense, and a few of the students reportedly raised a middle finger. Clearly, Officer Adams' defense of strangling an unarmed black man is going over well with the voters. Yeah, he's finding out what happens when he's not standing behind a podium with only the white media in front of him. Now that he's got to stand in front of the people, it's a whole other ball game. When you're a former member of the Pig Patrol and you spend most of your time with your snout up some white supremacist donors behind, you tend to forget that there's a lot more angry voters out there than there are rich white supremacist donors. Officer Adams was facing the music, at least for a moment, for praising and endorsing the lynching of a black man. He wasn't in the cozy confines of the white media where nobody will question him or oppose him. And what did he have to say for himself? He said, "We're watching a clear lack of desire to even participate in healthy dialogue." Was it healthy dialogue when Officer Adams used the killing of Jordan Neely, basically on the day that it came to light, as his opportunity to say, well, the public's tired of crime, especially in the subways? And he was talking about the man who had been killed, not the person who killed him. The only crime that was committed that day was when Daniel Penny snuck up on Jordan Neely from behind and strangled him to death. That was the only crime that happened that day. What part of praising a lynching is healthy dialogue? That bastard Adams doesn't want a dialogue. He's been doing all the talking so far, and the white media's been making sure that it's been a one-way lecture. He doesn't listen. That's not a dialogue. That bastard, along with that shrew-looking heifer who calls itself the governor of New York, praised and defended the violent and intentional lynching of Jordan Neely. Both of them were on that train. That is, until they realized that the racist white supremacist donors and the white media executives they take orders from are only a handful of people. The masses, however, are against them. Adams, realizing that this one went way bad ahead of schedule, tried to engage in some phony self-valorization by saying, "My message to those who believe that their beliefs are the only beliefs in a diversified city like New York, my message to you, instead of being a detached spectator in the full contact sport called life, get on the field and participate about improving the lives of the people in this city." First of all, improving the lives of the people in the city is exactly what those kids were doing. When you have the mayor of the nation's largest city decide that he is going to praise and cheer on the lynching of a black man, that makes the mayor the biggest threat to public safety in the city. He's got his nerve trying to take those conscientious students and try to paint them out as somehow being intolerant. The rich white donors who Officer Adams works for, they're the ones who think that their beliefs are the only beliefs in the city. A handful of rich white supremacists think that their beliefs are the only ones that matter. And he wouldn't dare talk down to them. He wouldn't dare even question them. Certainly not publicly. So this cowardly sack of crap is talking tough to people who he thinks can't punish him at the polls. He thinks campaign donations is all he needs. And his sports analogy is a laugh. Those kids who were booing him, they were already in the game of life. And playing very well, might I add, because they recognize Eric Adams as being on the opposing team. You see, in the game of life, Officer Eric Adams has chosen to be the water boy. He carries water for whatever white supremacist interests want him to do it. He's of no use for anything else. So this is what's been going on in New York the last several days. That's why charges were brought. But as we all know, Officer Eric Adams fully supported the lynching of Jordan Neely, and the DA, Alvin Bragg, didn't want to bring charges in the first place. Why would he? He and Eric Adams both work for the exact same white supremacist donors for the exact same reason. And those white supremacist donors, they have been completely and thoroughly unbudging in their demand that there be violent killings used as ethnic cleansing to get black people out of the city of New York. You have never seen any politician anywhere praising the wanton killing of a homeless person before, and yet you had both New York's mayor and governor, both of whom are supposed to be liberals, or so I hear, openly praising the lynching of Jordan Neely within hours of hearing about it. As soon as they had their first press conference, both of them could not wait to say, well, there's consequences for behavior, and what the public's tired of being scared of. When something this blatant and deliberately counter to public sentiment happens, that's how you know there's a program at work here. This has been a white supremacist goal for decades now. The same way low-down Willie Brown presided over the forced exodus of black people from San Francisco, now you got the white supremacists on the East Coast who are expecting Officer Adams and DA Bragg to do the same thing there. Alvin Bragg is only looking for a way out of this situation, and he needs a solution that doesn't require him to actually prosecute Daniel Penny for strangling an unarmed black man to death. And I think it's clear that Bragg's looking to use the same play that Ken Thompson, the disgraced and deceased former DA of Brooklyn, used when he deliberately and illegally refused to prosecute the murderer Peter Liang. Ken Thompson had an open and shut case, and because of money from certain Asian business interests, Thompson thought that he was going to climb the political ladder over Akai Gurley's dead body. But as we all know, he didn't make it that far. Very soon after he conspired to let Peter Liang off the hook with no prison time, he got cancer and very quickly afterwards died. So this is the playbook that Alvin Bragg is looking to copy. He's gotten some headlines, which he's hoping will get the heat off of him, and this time we had the extraordinary instance of there actually being the public allowed to see the killer in handcuffs. But now that the charge is a piddling second-degree manslaughter and the killer's been let out on bail, Bragg has now set the stage for a plea deal to be made and no time served. That's the point that he wants to reach, if public attention to this case dies down. But even if it doesn't, Bragg can just pull a Ken Thompson and say, well, it would be too hard to win this case, so we decided to take a plea. Now, as we saw in the federal trial of the murders of Ahmaud Arbery, that's what prosecutors say when they don't actually want to bring a case, open and shut though it may be. Prosecutors in the U.S. clearly have their own unwritten national policy that where the black victims of white supremacist violence are concerned, you don't go to trial, you cut a plea deal with the killers instead. That's not because they don't think they can win the case. It's because in the U.S., the laws are not a criminal code. It's a set of racial codes. And you have the white media making it clear they endorse this heinous lynching. They're openly and unabashedly celebrating what they know to be a deliberate act of taking an unarmed man's life, not because the killer was under threat, but because he was counting on racial privilege to set him loose. Why not? It's happened so many times before. The white supremacists are doing what they've done since Zimmerman and organizing the state mental health disability checks to go to this creep's so-called legal defense, him and his shyster lawyers. By the way, to all you white supremacists who troll and lurk around here, I know some of you scumbags are going to give your bingo money to this guy. Just remember your hero, Kyle Rittenhouse, and his lawyers were having knockdown dragouts over their legal donations before it was all over. No honor among sleaze. But of course, this isn't about the law at all. It's about sending black people a racial message. The thugs in blue have been put on their back foot the last few years. They're on the defensive. So, as we saw with Rittenhouse and others, since the regular forces of white supremacy are being regularly punished now, we see the white media trying to run interference for and encourage the irregular forces of white supremacy to carry out racial ambushes in their place. We've seen time and again that any white supremacist without a badge but with a gun who harms a black person or any non-black person who stands in solidarity with black people is immediately given the velvet glove treatment by the white media, the same way they do to the police. If that white assailant has priors, it won't be mentioned. And whomever they killed, if the person has priors, that will be the very first thing mentioned in any article about them, and the white media will make sure to devote a number of paragraphs to that alone. And they'll also claim, well, it's so difficult to convict. The law gives the killer every right to kill that black person, things they never say when the accused is black. The Wall Street Urinal put up a story calling this cowardly killer a Samaritan. He snuck up behind an unarmed man who was experiencing a mental crisis, and he strangled the man to death. When other passengers on the train told him to stop, he continued to strangle this man until he was dead. And to call this guy a Samaritan shows that Rupert Murdoch's propaganda mill doesn't know anything more about the Bible than the average white right Republican. In the Bible, the Good Samaritan was the one who helped a stranger who had been beaten and robbed, obviously by the Daniel Penny of his day. The Good Samaritan helped a stranger in need. He didn't strangle the stranger to death. So they define a Good Samaritan as someone who kills an unarmed man instead of trying to get him help. They also gave a foghorn to other white supremacists to get on code. Quote, every subway rider in New York knows the experience. You get on a train and a passenger nearby is shouting to himself or at others. They're right. Every single passenger on a New York subway has encountered some person who's having a mental crisis or is dealing with mental illness. And none of those people has strangled that stranger to death. In New York, a city of millions, it is the norm to have people with mental issues on every subway. And they talk to themselves or say weird things or disturbing things. This is part of New York life, unpleasant though it may be. When you have millions of people living in a city, it's only natural that a few of them might have mental illness. But it's not illegal. And the Wall Street Urinal admits that. They admit every subway rider in New York knows this experience. So it's not some unusual, never-before-experienced, shocking thing. This is the norm in New York City. But Daniel Penny's murderous response was not normal at all. Rupert Murdoch's racial propaganda mill says, you move away as far as you can, perhaps wondering if you should intervene to calm him down or stop the harassment. And what does intervene mean? To 99% of people, that means saying something. But Daniel Penny didn't say anything at all. He didn't call the police. He waited until Jordan Neely's back was turned. Then he jumped Jordan Neely from behind and strangled him to death. And he kept strangling him even after passengers told him to stop. Even after passengers told him, you're going to kill him. Daniel Penny heard them say that. And that was when he began to strangle Mr. Neely even more forcefully until he did kill him. Intervene doesn't mean to start a physical altercation with an unarmed man whose only offense is that he's yelling. That's why the killer's entire defense is going to be, well, Daniel Penny was protecting everyone else from this guy's words. You can't lie and say, well, he was beating someone or he pulled a knife on someone or a gun. Instead, they say, well, his words, he was talking, you see, his words, he was talking. The Urinal says most of us walk away and get on another subway car. Daniel Penny took the risk and intervened. No, he acted like the coward he is. He waited until a man who was smaller than himself and who was admittedly hungry and tired turned his back, and that's when that coward decided to jump him from behind and strangle him to death, all while the passengers were telling the killer, you're going to kill him. You had all these New Yorkers standing around, none of them did what he did. And you had all these New Yorkers saying you're going to kill the guy. That's an open and shut case right there that he did not do what a reasonable New Yorker would have done. This was not a good Samaritan. This was just a common killer. But the white media is lauding this animal. When have you ever seen the white media do that? Oh yeah, when Kyle Rittenhouse gunned down 3 people. See, there's a lot of Negroes out here playing a game with themselves, that the white media can be shamed into civilized behavior. Well, we're just going to pretend like the white media's lies are just the result of them being confused, or they just don't have all the information, or they're just victims of the environment they were raised in. Surely they know better than this. Too many black people are trying to convince themselves that evil doesn't exist. Black people who pretend as if the white media does anything other than tell anti-black lies, you're as bad as the white supremacists. And it's not just the white right pushing these lies. The white left media is making sure that all stories they write about this lynching start off by mentioning Mr. Neely may have had some priors, which they never do when a black person is accused of harming a white person. Keep that in mind. You'll be seeing it again soon. Like Kyle Rittenhouse, this has all become just another political football in the game of power politics, or rather the game of anti-black racism. Now, unlike with the Kenosha killings, this lynching happened in New York City. So there is a chance that one or two reasonable people might get on the jury, though I wouldn't make any avowals about the quality of New York City's judges. But the real problem is that there's a DA who wants to bury this case. Problem for Bragg is that the evidence and the public's refusal to let this crime go isn't allowing him to just sweep this one under the rug. He's not going to wait this one out. See, trash like Angela Corey deliberately threw the case against George Zimmerman, so the public threw her out of office. Trash like Anita Alvarez tried to cover up and bury the murder of Laquan McDonald by the murderer Jason Van Dyke, but the public found out and threw her out of office. Tim McGinty, who refused to prosecute the murder of Tamir Rice, he got kicked out of office. Amy Wyrick, who maliciously prosecuted a black woman for daring to vote in the state of Tennessee, was herself voted out of office. Well, I guess that's why she didn't want black people voting. So prosecutors have been forced to pay a price when they try to stand up for white supremacy because the public now remembers. Alvin Bragg won office on a so-called justice platform, but what's happened in reality is that he's just more the same. And he's intentionally making this opening, leaving a void to be filled by the white media, who's doing what they can always be predictably counted on to do, smearing the black victim and praising the killer. We only see this total support for killing an unarmed person whenever the person killed is black. And notice how you never see Democrats running on a platform of putting these race killers in prison? So on one end of the political spectrum, you have Republicans cheerleading for and celebrating race killers, and on the other end of the spectrum, you have Democrats remaining totally silent on the issue or even offering these murderers praise and defending them like we had with Officer Adams and Governor Hochul. John White of Long Island, New York defended himself and his family from three punks who beat his son at a so-called party. When his son got away, the three punks got in their car and followed the boy home. Then they stood outside the White family's house, demanding Mr. White send his son out. These were teenagers doing this, and yet they were acting like any other violent lynch mob from 120 years ago. These violent punks literally came to this man's doorstep, threatening John White's life and that of his family. He came out armed and told them to leave, which was his right. They refused. They were in front of his property telling him that they demanded he send his son out. One of them went for Mr. White's gun, and that's when it went off. Now, did anyone laud John White for that? Of course not. Did anyone call him a suburban Superman? Of course not. Did the Wall Street Journal call him a suburban Samaritan? Of course not. Did they praise him? Hell no, they were saying he's touched off a debate now about self-defense. Oh, they were sitting here just indicting this man. Did they talk about how difficult it would be to charge or convict him, or how the legal standard is just so high, or how the castle doctrine or stand your ground makes it impossible to get a conviction? Of course not. When the accused is black, the only discussion is about how many years he's going to get, and how sympathetic we must be toward the person that he killed. You didn't see Mike Bloomberg or Andrew Cuomo or anyone else praising him and saying, well, people are tired of crime, Well, there are consequences for behavior, You didn't see anyone talking like that. See, the white media and these politicians never praise a black man who kills a white person, for any reason. When the assailant is black, they won't even acknowledge that any circumstance could ever justify it. Instead, in so-called liberal New York State, John White, rather than be praised for protecting his family like he would be if he was a white man, instead he was arrested, put on trial in a kangaroo court by an all-white jury, and then sentenced to several years in prison. He did not initiate that confrontation. Those three racist punks came to his home. He told them to leave. They said they wouldn't. The so-called castle doctrine makes it clear that he had no obligation to let these punks threaten him or his property. And when the situation inevitably went tragic, it was not John White's fault. John White was a law-abiding citizen, never in trouble with the law. There is no question that John White was not the one responsible for that tragedy. If those three punks hadn't assaulted his son, at least one of them would still be alive today. If those three punks hadn't come to his home in the middle of the night, at least one of them would still be alive. If those three punks had simply left when he told them to leave, at least one of them would still be alive. John White himself explained that the person who got shot actually tried to go for his gun. John White didn't start busting shots from the front door, not like that scumbag who tried to murder Ralph Yarl. John White committed no crime. But in America, a black man who defends himself, that is the crime. It was only because of the belated but still effective intervention of Governor Patterson that freed this innocent man. John White should sue the DA's office for malicious prosecution. Now again, John White lived in Long Island. That's where this racist incident happened. And you know who else is a resident of Long Island? Daniel Penny. He lives in Long Island, and thanks to the case of Mr. John White, we know exactly what the anti-black racist culture of Long Island is. We know how deep it runs. Daniel Penny thought that he could kill a black man in cold blood and that the police and prosecutors wouldn't do anything about it. And for the first almost 2 weeks, that's exactly what happened. We'll continue with the moment of truth in just a moment, but first, a word from the official sponsor of Black Empowerment, Power Tools. There's no telling when something's going to come up, so make sure you carry your power tools at all times. You never know when you're going to need to bring the hammer down, or when you'll have some trash that needs to be blown away, or some obstacle that requires cutting down. Don't get caught empty-handed. Keep your hammer close by. Keep that leaf blower at the ready, and always carry your steel. Power Tools. Because no matter what your day job or side hustle may be, there's no excuse for not being ready to put in some work. On the day he intentionally strangled Mr. Neely to death, the crooked NYPD didn't arrest him, and for 2 weeks afterwards, no action was taken against him. As he saw it, his racial privilege had been validated. And the same racists who we see calling this killer a Samaritan, they were the ones condemning Corey Pujols last year. You'll recall that Corey Pujols was a Dunkin' Donuts employee in Florida who was being threatened and verbally attacked by a white man in the drive-thru. Now that white man, Vonell Cook, was angry about his donut order. Attempts to calm him down didn't work. Instead, as usual, being civil towards a white supremacist only makes them more aggressive. So this guy decided that he was going to park his car and come into the Dunkin' Donuts, and when he did, he began screaming and yelling at the staff. And that's when the young manager, Corey Pujols, told the man, calm down. Now, anyone who works in fast food will tell you that this is a dangerous situation that this man instigated. Fast food workers are routinely attacked and even killed on a frighteningly regular basis. So when some angry, erratic white supremacist comes along storming into the store, that's no small thing. Despite Mr. Pujols' efforts, this racist cook began screaming racial slurs at Corey Pujols himself. Now that's automatic menacing and terroristic threats right there. Mr. Pujols had come under attack, and he would have been justified in whatever measure he took to ensure his safety. Under Florida's stand your ground laws, he had no obligation to turn back or back down or take even one step back, because he had been personally threatened by someone who was now in his face. This vulgar white supremacist got in the drive-thru, then he decided to leave the drive-thru, park his car, get out of his car, walk into the Dunkin' Donuts, and begin screaming and throwing racial epithets and threats. But in an extraordinary display of discipline, which the killer thug Daniel Penny never showed, Mr. Pujols continued to try to de-escalate the situation. He told Vonell Cook to calm down and stop using racial slurs, but again, because Mr. Pujols tried to show civility to a white supremacist, that only emboldened the white supremacist. Mr. Pujols told his co-workers to call the police. He politely asked this white supremacist to leave the store. Vonell Cook refused. Now he was trespassing. And not only did he not leave, he intensified his racist attacks, more racial slurs. So Mr. Pujols, acting in his legal rights, defended himself from this racial attack. He used only as much force as was necessary to ensure his safety and those around him. He didn't strangle the white supremacist to death, and he didn't strike him more than once or stomp him to a bloody pulp. It was the very definition of a proportional response, and even the DA agreed. The white supremacist, however, died in the hospital 3 days later. Now, what needs to be noted here is that there was one little detail that the white media tried like crazy to bury from all of their stories about this incident. Vonell Cook was a registered sex offender. See, Fox News buried that little detail literally at the bottom of their story. They left that detail until the very end, and they only devoted a few words to it, not even a complete sentence. So there was no attempt to dirty up the victim, quote unquote, by the white media. Now, if the races had been reversed, the very first thing we would have seen in all of these articles would have been, Corey Pujols, a sex offender. That would have been the very first paragraph. They would have gone into withering detail about all the charges against him and his convictions and what it was for. Instead, in the white supremacist rag of record, Fox News, they bury it at the end of the story with only a few words devoted to it. And the New York Times wasn't much better. Just like Fox News, they buried Cook's sex offender status at the bottom of their story too. The New York Times only saw fit to give it 2 brief sentences. They limited their coverage only to saying that this white supremacist sex offender had served time in prison on several charges, including child abuse, possession of child pornography, and sexual activity with minors. Thousands of images and videos of teenage boys and men having sex were found at his home. Man, if this is what this guy was doing, why wasn't that mentioned at the beginning of the article? Because you see, the New York Times also left out the part about how this guy was luring children to his house. And he didn't just have sexual activity with a child, he raped a child. That's what he actually did. They left that out. They're sitting there minimizing and using sanitary sexual activity with minors. No, he actually raped a child. They left that out. He had been luring children to his house with video games and comic books and candy. They left out that he would use these children in his sick pornographic degeneracy, and that he had been doing this for decades, at least since the 1980s. Back then, he was charged with child molestation. And the New York Times also left out how this guy who they want you to think was a harmless old man, after he was convicted on those sex crimes charges, he disappeared. I mean, you're beginning to see how much the New York Times left out, and they did it deliberately. How do I know? Because in 2006, the New York Times reported on this story. And back then, they reported that this guy had been arrested for drugs. That was just one of the many details they left out when they covered it up. Covered it last year. In 2006, the New York Times actually reported that this guy owned 2 sex bookstores. But by last year, they forgot all about that detail too. See the lengths they went to minimize a child rapist who had tons of child pornography, had been violating children. I think that's far worse than anything Mr. Neely was ever accused of. And yet the white media protected this child rapist. They minimized his crimes, left out what the crimes were. Just giving you just the barest of details, if that. And they make sure to leave any mention of his sex crime convictions at the very end of the article. Why? Because of the white media, they know that fully 80% of the people who read online stories only read the headlines. They don't actually read the articles. 4 out of 5 people don't. They just read the headline and that's pretty much it. And that's what the New York Times wanted. The New York Times. All the lies that's fit to print. Lies by omission. See, the white media tried to make this guy out to be some kindly grandfather who was upset because his donuts didn't have sprinkles on them. But why didn't the headlines read what they should have? Child molester and rapist killed by Dunkin' Donuts employee. Because that's what actually happened. They buried that. They tried to put a slant on it like, this was about race. It was about a hell of a lot more than that. But why would the white media be so eager to cover for this child molester? That's because a huge number, in fact, a majority of people who work in the white media are no different, no better than this Cook creep. Don't you recall that most of the well-known people who we heard about during the Me Too storm were white media figures? Now, this incident happened just last year, in Florida of all places. Now, who was the governor of Florida last year? Oh yeah, moron DeSantis. This clown who's been pretending as if he's against child grooming, and yet you had a violent child molester who attacked a black man at a donut shop. And where was DeSantis or any of the racist police down there to call Corey Pujols a hero? Where were any of them to say this is a good man and we should be all glad that this guy is protecting children? Where was the New York Times at, or CNN, or these other white media toilets to say that it's so difficult to get a conviction for manslaughter? The DA overcharged this man. I don't think the victim will be very sympathetic. They weren't talking like that at all. Nobody was saying the victim isn't going to be sympathetic. Instead, they buried the fact that this guy was raping children. They buried that. They decided, we can't put that in there. It would be the wrong narrative. We're not going to dirty up the victim. We only do that if the person is black. The white media didn't frame their coverage in terms of justifying what happened. They instead only talked about how much time Corey Pujols was likely to get. Not one of the white media stories about this case started off with Vondell Cook, a convicted child rapist who did time for kiddie porn and sexually abusing children, ... They didn't start off with that. They didn't make it a point to give a brief rundown of his criminal past, which actually was relevant, by the way. Because that's a racial policy by the white media. The Wall Street Urinal wasn't calling Corey Pujols a Dunkin' Donuts defender. Fox News is owned by the same company that owns the Wall Street Journal, Rupert Murdoch's News Corp, and yet the Wall Street Urinal didn't say a word about this case. Well, if they had, would the copy have read like this? Every fast food employee knows the experience. You come to work and a customer begins shouting at customers or at you. He may say he wants his money back or hurl racial slurs. You move away as far as you can, perhaps wondering if you should intervene to calm him down or stop the harassment. Should you take the risk? Most of us walk away or get another job. Corey Pujols, a store manager, took that risk and intervened to subdue Vondell Cook, a convicted sex offender and child rapist who was screaming racial slurs and threats at Mr. Pujols. Do you think that's how the Wall Street Urinal would have reported it? You have never and would never see that kind of story written about any black man who was accused of killing a white person under any circumstances. But this is how Rupert Murdoch's Wall Street Urinal decided to rewrite the lynching of Jordan Neely. Daniel Penny wasn't intervening in anything. He snuck up behind Mr. Neely and strangled him to death. He wasn't restraining him. Passengers were the ones who told Penny to stop. How was he intervening to protect anyone when it was the very passengers who said, "Stop, you're going to kill him"? And getting back to the story of the sex offender Vondell Cook, how did the white rights audience react when they heard how Corey Pujols defended himself? When they heard that this child rapist had been killed, what did they say? Well, surely being the Fox News crowd, the so-called Law and Order crowd, they heard that if someone starts a loud argument in the drive-thru and then parks their car, storms into the restaurant and begins screaming at the employees, well, you can't be surprised when someone defends themselves, right? That's what the Fox News crowd was saying, right? After all, unlike Jordan Neely, Vondell Cook was screaming racial slurs and threats directly at Mr. Pujols. And Cook had no mental illness, by the way. He was just a sick, perverted, degenerate child rapist. So no sympathy for him from the Fox News crowd, right? Of course not. That pack of scumbags were defending that child molester. They were saying stuff like, "When I was a child, we learned to handle verbal attacks by reciting sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. I have to think that's not taught anymore as today's world is so concerned with the words rather than their effect. The old man was wrong, but so was the younger man whose response was disproportionate to the offense." Say, does anyone see any of these Fox News degenerate readers saying that Daniel Penny should have recited sticks and stones? Not one of them is saying that Daniel Penny is too concerned about words rather than their effect. They're not saying that at all. They're not saying, well, it's just words, what are you concerned about? No, they're saying exactly the opposite. They're saying that anyone who even thinks that what they're hearing is threatening, even if it's not against them, well, they're justified in whatever they do in response, even if it's a cowardly act like sneaking up behind an unarmed person and strangling them to death. Another piece of talking filth on the Fox News message board called Trump's Girl scribbled, "They no longer teach our children how to de-escalate a situation or how to problem solve. They teach them that their feelings matter and that no one is allowed to upset them." Oh, really? So you have a convicted child rapist who barges into a restaurant, hurls racial abuse at a black man who refuses to leave when told to leave, and then when he gets stopped, the Fox News crowd says the problem is that people are taught their feelings matter and no one is allowed to upset them. Yeah, like a thug on a subway train who says a mentally unsettled man's benign rantings were some sort of threat. None of the Fox News degenerates were saying that Daniel Penny needed to be taught how to de-escalate a situation. None of them were saying, gee, people only teach folks like Daniel Penny that their feelings matter and that no one's allowed to upset him. No, there's no talk about white entitlement on that one. Trump's Girl also wrote about de-escalation. She mentioned that word twice. Daniel Penny could have stayed in his seat, and he did. Until Jordan Neely's back was turned. He didn't de-escalate the situation. By the way, the Marines teach that. The Army and the Marines both teach soldiers how to de-escalate situations, which, by the way, is an important skill when you occupy foreign countries. But the thug Daniel Penny didn't escalate anything. In fact, he took a situation that was merely unpleasant and he chose to escalate it and make it violent. He chose to escalate the situation. He could have sat in his seat, could have called the police, could have ignored the guy, but he didn't. But a year ago, Corey Pujols was in a situation that actually was dangerous. You got somebody who goes from the drive-thru, parks their car, and now he comes into the store, he's confronting you? No, that was a threat. He had a registered sex offender, a convicted child rapist, who was in his face throwing racial epithets. Oh, but they weren't taking his side, right? They were on the side of the child rapist. Another Fox News nitwit ranted, "This cannot stand. Assault is not justified by any word. Punching an elderly person is always a high risk of great bodily harm or death. This light sentences is guaranteed to result in more violence over name-calling." Assault is not justified by any word? Well, this is the Fox News crowd. Logical thinking, basic decency is something they're incapable of, as well as basic English. The same trash who today are saying that Jordan Neely deserved to die because of his words a year ago were saying Vonell Cook didn't deserve to die for any reason. And to say punching an elderly person is always a high risk of bodily harm or death, well, that goes quadruple for chokeholds. That's why police departments are barred from using them. When you use a chokehold, there is a very high likelihood of harm or death, and Daniel Penny had been in the Marines. He knew when he snuck up behind Jordan Neely and strangled him to death that that's exactly what could occur. And then this J. Rollo person wrote, "This light sentence is guaranteed to result in more violence over name-calling." That's an admission from the Fox News crowd that they know when killers like George Zimmerman are allowed to walk scot-free for killing a black person, that this encourages more racial violence. They know it. And that's the entire reason that they cheerlead for these scumbags. None of them cared that Cook was a sex offender. They didn't even mention it. It was the last sentence in the article. It was right above the comment box, so they all saw it. Mike Ross wrote, "Always print the judge's name when they nullify a deserved sentence. The community needs to know what evil has been elected seat on the bench." Now, he's not concerned about the evil of Vonell Cook, the child rapist. They couldn't be concerned about that. Apparently, that's not evil. But a judge who actually follows the law, that's the evil. That's the white supremacist mindset. Racism, injustice, these things are not evil. Enforcing the law without respect to skin color, that is, equal justice under the law, is evil for the white supremacist. And by the way, these clowns don't read, because if the idiot had read the article instead of just the headline, he would have seen that it was the prosecutor who offered a plea deal. The judge couldn't do anything but sign off on it. If the judge refused to, the prosecutor wasn't going to bring the case. The state's attorney said so. Again, going to the New York Times, Andrew Warren, the state attorney for that district, said it would have been a difficult case to win at trial given Florida's legal landscape. Quote, "If you can shoot someone for throwing popcorn at you under Florida's flawed stand your ground law, it would be hard to convince a jury that a person's not allowed to hit someone who instigated a confrontation by storming into their business and barking the most aggressive and inflammatory term in the English language in their face." The state's attorney also mentioned that Mr. Pujols has no criminal record, first offender status, which explains why the white media didn't say a word about him. They didn't have anything to dirty him up with. By the way, you'll notice someone else who didn't say anything about him, Ron DeSantis. He didn't say a word at all. They were singing a different tune just a year ago. And that's the real reason the Fox News crowd was so offended. Most of the Fox News audience is old, the 65 to dead demo. So when they hear about some 77-year-old child rapist, they all automatically think, hey, that's literally me. And it is because the Fox News crowd watches just so they can see blonde women wearing skirts. Vonell Cook was a dirty old man, and the Fox News crowd are dirty old men. They look at him and they literally see themselves. And that also goes for the racial slurs part. These racist creeps post racist messages all day long from behind their keyboards or their cell phones. But then they see what they perceive as lethal consequences when someone tries that in the real world, and it frightens them. Vonell Cook was an avatar for the Fox News audience, old white supremacist perverts who spew racial epithets. But there was also one more comment that I think needs to be noted. One of the main whines that the Fox News crowd made was, Why didn't the young man stay behind the counter? He should have let the police handle it. He came from behind the counter instead of waiting for the police to handle it. When he walked from around that corner, that was the same as someone getting out of their car to confront someone. In each case, they become the aggressor. Stay behind the counter, stay in the car. Simple. Now, when someone tells them that Daniel Penny should have remained seated and waited for the police to handle it, they're the main ones who say, this kind of thing happens on New York subways all the time. Somebody needed to do something. Well, black people get called racial slurs all the time, and yet they say Corey Pujols should have done nothing. That's a racial double standard. The Fox News nitwits were saying, stay behind the counter, stay in your car. A year ago they were saying that. And today we say Daniel Penny should have stayed in his seat. And you notice that the Fox News crowd are total illiterates. This idiot wrote, stay behind the counter, stay in your seat. The entire reason that this incident happened at that Dunkin' Donuts was because the child rapist Vonell Cook was in the drive-thru, then he parked his car, then he got out of his seat in his car so that he could confront Mr. Pujols, the very thing that they were whining about. It's no different than someone who gets out of their car to confront someone. In each case, they become the aggressor. Yeah, well, that's exactly what Vonell Cook was. He was the aggressor. Stay in your car. Simple, remember? But Vonell Cook was the one who got out of his car and went into that restaurant. That's what happened before anything else in this chain of events, but the Fox News crowd, of course, ignores that. This is what you call psychopathic racism. They will gladly overlook that this guy was a convicted child rapist, that he did time in prison for kiddie porn and sexually violating children. Then they'll make some feeble comparisons saying that it's no different than getting out of your car to start a fight when that's exactly what Vonell Cook did. When he was told to leave, he didn't and he continued his assault. Mr. Pujols was under attack and he defended himself, which was the right thing to do. Black people are constantly attacked, harmed, and even killed by white supremacists like this child rapist Cook. And too many times we hesitate to defend ourselves or to defend other black people who are under assault because we worry about the fact that the police and the prosecutors and the white media will take the side of the people attacking or killing us. And what normally happens is it's a black person who winds up dead. But the story about Mr. Pujols can be put in the same category as the one about Mr. White. They were confronted and threatened racially by individuals who were not suffering some sort of mental crisis. And Daniel Penny is no victim here. He knew exactly what he was doing. He knows what the U.S. military's rules of engagement are. He knows that if he was still in Iraq, he would never have been able to do what he did without being court-martialed. That's why so many white supremacists in the military, as soon as they get out of service, they immediately apply to become a police officer. And to the white supremacists, they're cheering this scumbag because they take L after L from black men all the time. That's why they were screeching about that whole story with the child rapist who got killed. That's what they were really upset about. These white supremacists try to call themselves fighting a black man, and all they get is an L. That's why so many of them run around with guns. When all you know how to do is play Call of Duty and whine about women not liking you, you're not qualified to do anything with your hands. To these white supremacists, these cowardly ambushes are the closest they can get to a win, so they'll take it because it's either that or nothing. Does anyone think Humpty Dumpty looking trash like Kyle Rittenhouse could win a fist fight against a 10-year-old? He couldn't even win a fight against a high school girl, and there's video of him barely being able to hold his own against a teenage girl. There's video of it. That's why he runs around with a gun. He needs to so he can feel like something other than the total coward and the weak, unmanly piece of dirt that he knows he is. He's in hiding today. Sure, he can stick his head up for a hot second to do some white right-wing appearance, but after that, it's back to an undisclosed location. That's how these white supremacists are. They see example after example of black men handing them L's, and for them, they're just desperate to see a single instance, any instance, of some white supremacist thug who's able to walk away from a situation that they started without their friends having to pick him up off the ground. So that's why they want to cheerlead for this guy. They don't care if it's the local child rapist like Vonell Cook. They'll cheerlead for him. They're trying to find someone who they can vicariously live through, have a vicarious victory through. Daniel Penny couldn't confront Mr. Neely face to face. He outweighed Mr. Neely by something like 30 pounds. Mr. Neely was hungry and thirsty, which meant that he was physically weak. And even so, it took all that little piece of trash's strength just to strangle a man who could barely stand to begin with. These white supremacists look at Daniel Penny and they see themselves. Someone who didn't have the honor or integrity to be in the Marines, someone who had to depend on racial privilege for every little bit of rank or any perk that he could get. They see someone who had to sneak up behind a skinny, small, non-threatening person, and to the white supremacists, that's how cowardly they are. A face-to-face fight would constitute a guaranteed L on their part. So they have to cheer on these cowardly little ambush killings like Peyton Gendry, who killed those black shoppers in Buffalo, or Dylan Roof, or Mike Dunn, who murdered Jordan Russell Davis. See, the same white supremacists who are saying Daniel Penny was a hero or a Samaritan, they were also praising all these other cowardly race killers as well, because these are the only examples of a white supremacist able to engage in violence against a black person without getting their butts handed to them. My recommendation to the family of Jordan Neely would be to file a wrongful death suit against the killer and against his other 2 accomplices. We'll continue to keep an eye on this one, but understand that the entire point of this killing is to try to regain the momentum that the white supremacists know that they've lost the last few years. They need for white supremacists to be emboldened, to kill with impunity. And now they know that when the public hears about these things, the public's going to call it out and bring pressure for justice to be done. Look what's happening down in Texas. Greg Abbott saw that white supremacist get convicted, and he's trying to overrule the courts and unilaterally overturn a conviction himself, because they can't depend on juries to be on code. We have weakened the enemy in their own home. You notice my wording because I know some people don't listen so well. I said they can't depend on these juries. Kim Potter found that out the hard way when an all-white jury convicted her. As I've always taught you, white supremacy is based on a system of goodies, giveaways, but most of all, guarantees. White supremacy is absolutely dependent on both tangible and psychological benefits handed to those classified as white. White supremacy is also fragile, so it needs to be reassured every day that it's not going to fall apart. Every time a white supremacist gets punished, every time that black people get justice, that means their house of cards is in danger. Yes, white power still controls the courts, obviously, and the vast majority of these cases are buried. Killers still get to walk. But the difference is, they no longer have a guarantee of it. And white power can't stand unless its beneficiaries know that their goodies and giveaways are guaranteed. Because if they're not, then the only thing that's guaranteed is punishment. Good evening, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Delvion Burton, Richard Allen Lovell, Mark Singleton, Sherrod Martin, and Roxanne Allen. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.